Okay, so it looks like we should really get started. A warm welcome to the Y Sports 2017 panel discussion on bridging the gap between sport and public health. My name is Barry Kelly. I'm Specialist Advisor Physical Activity for Health at London Sport, and I will be chairing the panel discussion today. Before I introduce our expert panel, if I'm still allowed to call people experts, I just wanted to run through the purpose of the session and the format. So the aim of today is to really examine the relationships that exist between public health, sport and the leisure sector, and in particular the period of time since public health responsibilities transferred through to local authorities in 2013. We will also consider what are the potential opportunities for our sector to further develop this approach. And to do this, we will try and answer three sort of very key questions. Firstly, what have been the challenges to developing a shared understanding and approach to physical activity? How we feel the relationship between public health, sport and leisure has evolved over the time of the last 4 years, and what more we need to do to try and bridge the gap and where those future opportunities for our sector exist. So in terms of the session format, we have got about 30 minutes for the discussion. We will close with 10 to 15 minutes Q&A from the audience. So if I could ask if you've got any questions to hold on to them until we finish, and then hopefully we can respond to them then. Is that clear? Great. So if I can just start by then introducing our panel. Firstly, second from the end there is Elaine McNish. Elaine is currently the Head of Health and Wellbeing at Swim England, a post which she took up in March, and she informs me she's worked in a host of other places before then. Prior to that, Elaine was also the Director at the British Heart Foundation National Centre for Physical Activity in Loughborough, so obviously is very new in post with Swim England. Secondly, at the very end, we've got Imran Chowdhury. Imran is the Director of Public Health at the London Borough of Hounslow. Imran's borough has taken a very innovative approach to embedding physical activity into its organisational structure and from a service perspective. Hounslow has a focus on addressing physical inactivity and in recent years has launched an integrated lifestyle service called One New Hounslow. And if I can also welcome Marianne Boyle, who's also from Hounslow. Imran might need to step off the stage at some point. Hopefully it's nothing to do with my questions, but more that he's got another appointment. So Marianne Boyle, who's a public health strategist at Hounslow, yes? Yeah, almost. Just nod.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Perfect,
Mary. And then finally, we have Nigel Robinson. Nigel is the Head of Sport and Leisure at the London Borough of Camden. Camden has been long recognised as a borough with a strong strategic partnership for physical activity and has historically had a very positive working relationship with public health, sport and leisure. Camden has delivered a number of initiatives such as Outdoor Gyms, Give It a Go and Camden Active Spaces, all in partnership with public health. And I'm sure Nigel will come on to that shortly. So a big welcome to all the panel. And I just would sort of like to start and open the discussion with looking at some of the challenges to developing an approach to physical activity. And if I can start with you, Nigel. As I mentioned in the introduction, Leisure and Sport in Camden is a long-standing relationship with public health that very much predates the move of public health to the local authorities. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about how those relationships developed and indeed were maintained and sort of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, it's a good question, Barry. Am I on, so to speak? Yeah, good. I think I want to start by saying a little bit about Camden, because what I'm about to say has to be put into a context. I'm mindful that at events like this, people like me get up and talk about their experience, and people in the audience think, well, I can't possibly do that because my borough is nothing like yours and there are different issues. And so just by way of an opening salvo, does anyone here live in Camden? Okay. Okay. Well, and if you were to describe Camden in less than 10 words, what would you say about Camden as a place to live and work and play?
Diverse and to extremes.
Okay. That's a pretty good description. I think Camden, when I think of Camden, and if you start nodding, then I know I'm saying the right things. I think of 2 national rail hubs. I think of an international rail terminus. I think of Camden Market. I think of the British Library. I think of Hampstead. I think what I'm saying is Camden's a pretty good place to live, and that was one of the things that attracted me to Camden, was this huge cultural and physical activity offer, and the environment itself has transformed over the years. If you've been to King's Cross recently, you'll see the massive transformation that's been undertaken in King's Cross and the opportunities that brings with it, both in terms of investment, both in terms of the built environment and making that built environment conducive to physical activity. So I guess I'm saying if you can't do a good job in Camden, you can't do it anywhere. And I think we have done a good job in Camden. The challenge for me when I first arrived 10 years ago in Camden was not public health. It was not forming a dialogue and a relationship with public health. It was in Camden itself and colleagues in transport, in regeneration, in planning, in housing and social care, who hadn't yet caught up with the message that actually sport and physical activity can make a contribution to a range of different outcomes. So that was the biggest challenge for me, and over time, I think that changed. So our Camden plan now has health improvement through physical activity as one of our key outcomes and priorities. And I don't see that changing going forward particularly. The beauty, and this really doesn't answer your question, but it turns it on its head, the strength of the relationship between my services and public health, who at the time was a PCT, was that we were knocking on an open door. These guys, the Assistant Director of Public Health in Camden, absolutely was passionate about sport and physical activity, as were all his colleagues, and understood absolutely the impact that it can make on a range, wider social determinants of health. So the door was open. And I think me and my team took a similar message. We weren't saying sport for sport's sake. We were saying, actually, this can make a really big impact. Sport and physical activity can make a huge impact in a number of different ways. The relationship developed because we all felt we needed to understand what the need was in Camden, so we invested time and energy in some systematic reviews and analysis of what the need was in Camden that took time and also investment. And that investment came through the strategic partnership, which is called Proactive Camden. The other critical element is that key stakeholders were represented at a very senior level. The Assistant Director of Public Health sat on that group. Assistant Directors and Directors of some of the services in Camden sat on that group. It was chaired by an independent person. And again, that helped engage a wider audience of people that might have suspected that this was just a public local authority talking shop, which it very much wasn't. It was very much driven by the needs of the local community and represented by local organisations. I think that was critical.
And was there anything in particular that sort of helped in terms of the relationships you formed with those colleagues in public health? Were they asking you to do different things, or was it very much a sort of easy relationship to develop?
I think, again, I'm not sure I'm answering the question in the way you intended, but I think what I wanted to say previously, Barry, was that the group set itself out with the task of addressing strategic issues and not just another forum where people just talked about sport development. Not that sport development isn't important, we'll get thrown tomatoes and eggs at me. But the raison d'etre of that group was, how do we address need in Camden?
Okay.
And what do we need to do in order to understand that need and then deliver to that need? And then we can perhaps come on later on about talking about investment and...
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Just moving on, Imran, obviously conscious of your time. If we could ask you about Hounslow. Hounslow took the decision to integrate the public health function with leisure, which obviously ensured that physical activity was sort of embedded within your overall sort of structure. Would you be able to tell us more about that approach and what the challenges were to it?
Thanks, Barry. So I think to be fair, it was probably driven by savings cuts at the time in terms of saving on a director of leisure, to be fair. However, I think compared to Nigel, I think our approach has been very much organically from the ground up. So the great thing for me was that actually, as a director of public health, also having a portfolio on leisure, was that actually I had the kind of buy-in already in terms of making the two services kind of work together. I also had the opportunity, I mean, in terms of back in 2014, in terms of where we were in terms of finances as in Hounslow. But actually, for me, the most important game changer for me in terms of bringing the two services together was, to be fair, I think public health needed to step up, really. Working in other authorities, public health have always been really good at kind of counting the numbers and talking about physical activity and their potential impact, and talking about nice guidance and what we could do better. But actually, I strongly felt back in 2014 that actually, if we're really going to be in a partnership, and clearly leisure can do an awful lot in terms of the leisure centres, in terms of parks, in terms of their interactions with the general public, then public health needed to have a serious offer on the table. And so my key challenge at that time to the team was that we had a very, what I call a kind of a 1970s model. And I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with that kind of model, which was we had a number of disparate lifestyle contracts inherited from the old PCT, lots of different providers, no single point of contact for the public. And in terms of what that offer looked like in terms of outcomes, we were only reaching a few hundred people. And then when you put that in kind of population health terms and the numbers of people that we have in Hounslow who are physically inactive, clearly it wasn't stepping up and meeting any of that need or challenge. So one of the key things for us was actually we took advantage of the procurement timelines to re-procure a new service with an integrated lifestyle service. So it does physical activity, does smoking, does alcohol, does eating, healthy eating as well, which is a one-stop shop, which is a single point for any resident in Hounslow to get information and advice on making lifestyle changes, but also does that in a very flexible way. So no longer are you only offered 10 sessions on a Monday afternoon in a group in the leisure centre, which I certainly couldn't do, and I think the vast majority of working people can't do. But actually, it's much more geared up at telephone support for local people, the use of apps, the use of a digital platform. I'm sure you've heard about 1U in the morning. So, when Public Health England pushed that branding, we took the opportunity to rebrand our lifestyle service as 1U Hounslow. So, one of the nice things about that is that when someone in Hounslow goes on the web and looks up 1U, they actually get directed to the Hounslow local website. So all of a sudden now, what's really nice is that we're not talking about a few hundred anymore. We're talking about thousands of people coming through our service, and all of a sudden, I think that's really important for us to begin to talk to leisure colleagues and say, actually, there is a synergy there. Because actually, if you've got nothing to bring to the table, it's very, very difficult to build that relationship.
Great, thanks. And Elaine, conscious that you were obviously very much working at a national level during this period, and obviously during that time we saw a kind of a lot of national documents and policy around trying to develop a shared approach, things like Everybody Active Every Day, the prevention agenda through NHS 5-year forward view. I was just wondering, based on your experiences, what you felt some of the challenges were in sort of integrating with the public health agenda, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's been a few challenges in terms of some of the work that I've been involved in across the years. I mean, the first one is language. When I was involved in setting up an exercise referral scheme across Wales when I was working in Wales, we didn't even know what to call people. Were they clients, patients? It was a challenge. Or, do we have, are we looking at customer retention, or are we looking at intervention adherence? The languages that we use is very different. It means the same thing. So we need to start thinking about unpicking that we have that common understanding of that. I think there's been a real challenge around ensuring that both health and sport know, understand and believe the evidence because we've seen lots of evidence presented up to us today, but when you go out and you ask a GP, do you at the heart and core of what you're doing actually believe the impact that physical activity can have on people's lives? They're not always bought into it all. So we do need to think about that. And we need to think about that evidence in different ways, because physical activity can help not just in prevention, but treatment, slowing the condition, helping people manage their condition. So, and that each of the evidence may come from different sources for that. So it's that understanding of that. Understanding each other's priorities and pressures, and we've heard a lot about that today, I think. We've heard the financial pressures that people are under. We know that having with public health moving into local government, they're now having to deal with, I'm sure you know more about this, the political cycles and the politicians out there, which makes it a very different world for them in that respect. And those are the problems they're trying to solve. For me, it's also, have we created a product that is appealing to the target groups? And I was really interested in some of the stuff that Barry had to say earlier about that, in terms of really understanding the market and understanding who the people are. And is what we are product that we are creating appealing not just to, obviously they're the most important as the target group, but commissioners and all the other people who may help and support that. And then the last one and the big one is trying to prove it's effective. And proving effective is not just, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can be about case studies. It can be about understanding, and it can be about looking at how are we saving money. So lots of different areas that we need to think about in that respect.
That's sort of a nice link into my next question, Imran, which is kind of based on sort of partly on the discussion we had a few weeks ago about the sort of breadth of responsibilities that public health has, and the sort of areas that public health is trying to sort of have influence over. You mentioned sort of had to have knowledge of planning, housing, adult social care, transport, parks and open spaces, to name a few. I think you mentioned you also looked after cemeteries as well, which I suppose for a public health person is quite interesting.
Helps with the collection of data.
Yeah, well, at least there's a final outcome, yeah. I was just wondering how you sort of manage those relationships and how you sort of build sort of public health, sport and leisure into those conversations that you have in that sort of broader sense of things.
So I do think having that attractive offer, so the kind of the lifestyle service, paired up with a lot of really other good interventions has really helped us build some really good relationships. So we've got an excellent relationship with Transport around Beat the Streets. So that's a 6-week campaign to get families, mainly of primary school children, to walk or cycle to school. And last year we had 30,000 participants across the borough. Marianne's team are rolling out a really interesting pilot with super active schools, where we're getting 12 schools, 10 schools to commit to an hour of physical activity a day in the schools. So it's very much been a kind of iterative process in terms of finding the people who are willing to talk, finding the people who've got some capacity, and trying to push at those open doors. Not everyone is willing to talk. That's the reality, and you've got to deal with that. But I think the other thing which has been really helpful, as well as some really good relationships, is I think one thing a director of public health can bring to the table is potentially that kind of whole system leadership approach. So we had a really good presentation at our Health and Wellbeing Board, where we had the physical activity team present to the leader of the council, the local acute trust, the mental health trust, the community healthcare trust, Job Centre Plus, the voluntary sector, and we had all of them sign up to a 10-year plan to tackle physical inactivity, and it's that kind of system leadership, which I think which is something that perhaps public health can do a lot more of. Planning, housing, these are all targets for the future. We've still got a lot more work to go there. But that's, those are but also the private sector as well. We've got Heathrow on our doorstep. We're really interested to actually talk to the private sector as well. But those are kind of our objectives for the medium term.
Great, and just sort of moving on to you, Nigel, and I suppose I was just wanting to reflect on, you've already had those strong relationships with public health. What's changed over sort of recent times, if anything, in terms of the relationship with public health and how you work with them? What difference has public health moving to the local authority made to what you do?
I think the governance has changed, Barry, and has got strengthened. So, as with a lot of people in the room, they'll understand it when I say there is a health and wellbeing board that has the mandate, and certainly in Camden, to drive through the health improvement agenda. Below that, there's the Healthy Weight, Healthy Lives task force, which is where the senior officers from across both public health and Camden's wider services sit. And then below that, there's Proactive Camden, which is the strategic body for the development of sport and physical activity in Camden. The Proactive Camden strategy, and we're in the process of redeveloping that following again another round of needs analysis that will be completed by the Christmas or December this year. That will inform a new strategy which will eventually be adopted by the Health and Wellbeing Board. So our targets and objectives are right at the very top of the political and health agenda. And I think that's really, really important in terms of being able to deliver what it is we want to deliver through sport and physical activity. And I think going back to that point about how important it is, as you were saying, about understanding the need in Camden, what that's enabled us to do over the last 10 years is, with that need, develop really effective strategies that have led, certainly in Camden's case, to over £5 million worth of non-council investment, partnership investment, and through that there have been some really innovative solutions and interventions for some of the critical health issues that affected Camden. Do you want to talk briefly about active spaces?
I was about to ask you about active spaces, yes.
Great. So
nice prompt.
I read your mind. So active spaces, again, it's how the context of that's interesting. Active spaces was a response from Proactive Camden to the above average rates of obesity, childhood obesity in Camden. They wanted a creative solution through increasing physical activity among years 5 and 6, especially in our local primary schools. So they came up with the idea of active spaces, which in essence are bespoke designed physical activity structures never seen before in 8 primary schools in Camden. The CCG funded that project to the tune of over £1 million. Of course, then we have to make sure that it's effective, and we partnered, another partner was UCL, College London, and the Institute of Sport and Health, who achieved a grant to do some longevity study on the impact of those active spaces, starting with doing baseline data on a sample of over 500 young people in those schools. They all were fitted with actigraphs that they can only ever take off when they're in the bath. And that measures their movement from baseline and their level of activity over a 2-year cycle. And the results are quite encouraging. They show that as a consequence of the active spaces, their levels of physical activity have improved quite significantly. So that's just an example of what can be achieved if you have the evidence, if you have corporate, community and strategic backing, and if you're speaking a similar language and similar desire with your public health colleagues.
Thanks, Nigel. And just, Elaine, very quickly, in terms of the sort of national perspective on this, I just wonder if you had any sort of thoughts on how that relationship's developed.
Yeah, I mean, what both of these stories share is how we've managed to bring the best bits of the health and the sport sector together. I'm going to take a bit of a liberty, but traditionally I think sport has, we're good at customer focus. We understand customers, we deal with them every day, we've got service, but we've sometimes not been very good at coming up with using evidence to create ideas and sharing best practice. I've got a good idea method of planning sometimes, and I'll hold my hand up. I've used that in the past as well. And health sometimes coming from a perspective that they understand that evidence, but can be a bit intransigent if there is no evidence. Now, we have to be careful, because no evidence doesn't mean that something doesn't work. It just means there's no evidence because we haven't got the research. So I think if we can bring together the strengths of both of those, and I think that's what some of the projects that they're talking about, how we've seen today, does, we can bring together that understanding, creating robust interventions, learning from evaluation and helping and supporting each other, but also learning from some of the insight that leisure has around the customers. So, for example, in Swim England, we've done a lot of work around trying to understand the customer experience, and we've been looking at. So, for example, our dementia-friendly swimming project uses we've got an area called the Frontiers that we have, which is really understanding how to create a whole systems environment to make swimming appealing to people with dementia. So that includes understanding the insight of people with dementia and what their needs are. So how do you market that or get people get people involved in that? How do you create an environment that's right? So we have a checklist which enables people to have a look at their environment. How do you get the training? And that's training for the whole staff within a centre, because a person doesn't walk in through the door and the first person they're greeted by is a person at reception probably. So we need to make sure that's a whole systems approach in that. And then getting the paths in, and that's about the partnerships that has been alluded to today. Non-traditional partnerships with leisure, potentially. Because often we've gone to the same people and we've had the same conversations. But the charities, we've recognised, in particular, we've got a really good example in Nottingham, where the Alzheimer's UK officer is the person who's going out to do the outreach to try and encourage people into the centre. And that's a really good way of doing it, because charities are trusted. Often if we walk in, we're like, well, what have you got to prove? But charities are trusted by these individuals, and we need to capitalise on that.
Thanks. I mean, it sounds like there's still a lot of opportunities out there, and I just wanted to sort of, my final question was really an open question to all of the panel, and feel free to chip in. Marion, I'm conscious I haven't come to you at any point, so if you feel like you just sit there. What more do we need to do to bridge the gap, and where do we feel the sort of future opportunities exist? And I jotted down some areas which I'll throw in a few things: sustainability, transformation plans, NHS 5-year forward view, the new Sport England approach to funding. There's a few others, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you feel are the kind of key things going forward for the sector. I'll start with Imran, because he's got his hand up.
Thank you. So, sustainability and transformation plans, which of course trips off everyone's tongue with ease. I think are an amazing opportunity, actually. Most STP plans that you will read are typical NHS bureaucracy, which you will be very, very familiar with. But actually, they're also an opportunity for local areas to make of the plans what they want, I feel. Most of them are very, very focused on prevention. Certainly our North West London plan is. The difficulty is actually what will that prevention offer look like. I was at a meeting last week with some of the diabetes clinical leads across North West London, and we were having a conversation about 65,000 patients identified on GP clinical systems who are known to be at high risk of developing diabetes in the future. They haven't, their blood sugar levels aren't high enough yet to be registered as diabetic. And the NHS is investing a lot of money in new programs like the National Diabetes Prevention Programme to try to change the lifestyle, to try to get these people eating better and more physically active. But actually, there's a big that programme will only probably take care of about 5% of those people. Mm-hmm. There's a real opportunity there, working across the sector for actually how do we communicate with those others. Because there's a real need. The NHS really wants something for those individuals as well. And that, I think, is potentially a massive, massive opportunity going forward.
Moving down the panel, Elaine.
I mean, it felt a little bit over the past 2 years that moons have aligned. I mean, I've been in this business for 30 years. In fact, I started in one of the leisure centres in Hounslow, so that was my first career. First job was in a gym there, and it's the first time that I've seen a number of government strategy all coming out and saying the same thing. And also there seems to be some, because we've seen it before, we've heard the whole physical activity and health before, but there was a change in politicians and it all went out the window. This feels like it's more embedded. So I think it feels like all of this is coming together and people are coming together and speaking a common language about it in terms of how they want to see this working. So I think that's a massive opportunity. I think we've got a massive opportunity to think about that, making every contact count, but think about it in terms of the wider workforce, not just the health workforce. Leisure workforce definitely has a huge role to play, and it's really good to hear that your leisure staff are involved in lifestyle information as well. Creating the right environments is vital to this, and making sure that we've got those right recruitment routes that I referred to earlier, and right partnerships in place. So I think there's lots of opportunities coming up in terms of. I'm really excited by the way that some of the things that we heard this morning from Sport England about that concept of let's actually look at those non-traditional partnerships that we've had, because we need to try and get and understand the needs of the individuals that we so far haven't had involved in the activities that we undertake.
Thank you. Marianne, would you like to add
Yeah,
anything?
I'd actually be quite interested to know how many people in here are local authority. If you could put your hands up if you're from a local authority, or NGBs, so quite a split, and then charity sector, quite a lot of charity sector. Okay, that just gives me a bit of a feel of your reasons for coming to this workshop, to get an idea of how that bridge needs to be gapped. I think public health for us within local authority, a big part of my role was changing the terminology. I come from sport development background. I'm very passionate about sport and what it can achieve, but that doesn't always ring true with the priorities around public health. So it's very important to think about how you are presenting your organisation and your organisation's priorities if you want to work closer with public health. That for me, in terms of recognition of the Sport England and their new approach with the new strategy and the focus on not just physical activity, but physical inactivity has been really, really important. Local authority-wise, we've changed our corporate priority from going, we want to get people from 3 times 30 up to 5 times 30. We're now talking about our inactives. We want to reduce our number of inactives. So we're taking that right through corporately and externally with our partners as well. We're trying to speak that language with, whether it's our Brentford Football Club that we work with, or our charity or voluntary sector organisations. We're trying to work with them on the language that we're speaking, because that's where the funding is as well, and that's what will release the funding for us to be able to deliver. And I'm by no means, as Nigel said earlier, demeaning sport and what sport can achieve, but it's a continuum, and it's a recognition that at the moment the focus is on the physical inactivity side of that continuum. Sport is still very, very important, but it's just changing that language, which I think has been talked about throughout the day. So.
Thanks. Should have brought you in earlier. Nigel, any sort of closing thoughts on that?
Well, as we were saying earlier, Barry, when we were outside and I was talking about our leisure centres in Camden, we've got 5. There's a 6th currently being built on the King's Cross estate. And the contract's up in 2020. Currently, we've got 40,000 registered members, and we're getting annual visits of over 2.5 million. And that's great. And it's great because that's around, to my mind, that's around preventative health. That's around getting the leisure literate, let's call them, engaged and active on a consistent, regular basis. That's really important. But what that hides is there are still significant numbers of people in Camden that don't use our leisure centres. So some of the questions we're going to be asking when we go with our needs analysis, the proactive Camden needs analysis, will be why? I think we know some of the answers. It's probably some of it is around price, around cost, around access, around perceptions that leisure centres and sports centres are places where only the fit go. So the vision in future, and this is a real opportunity, this new contract in 2020 will be to think of leisure centres changing that function a little bit and changing their perception. I'd like it to be a place where you go if you want advice around a range of health-related issues, not just because you want to leap about in Lycra. I want the provider to do some of the work that's being alluded to here. I want my provider in future, whoever that might be, because they're bound to be a substantial organisation with experience and capacity and resources. I want them to get out there in the community and start working with smaller organisations and helping them to develop a really good community-led sport and physical activity offer. the kind of ideas I'm looking for is for a provider to say, you know what, I think we need to have physical activity specialists in all your GP surgeries. I want someone to say, why shouldn't we have a practice nurse in one of our leisure centres? And God forbid, in future, why don't we co-locate a GP surgery in a leisure centre? And they're all possibilities, and I see that's a really important way that we can bring opportunities for sport and physical activity to a wider audience and meet a wider range of need.
Thanks for that. I was just obviously keen, sort of given the sort of time to open it out for questions. I don't think there is a roving mic, but if you would like to ask any questions of the panel, please raise your hand and be prepared to shout out at us. I think your hand was up first, so I'll go with you. If you could just also say who you are and what organisation you represent, that would be useful. Thanks.
Sure, my name's Joe Taylor, and I'm a charity called Follow Project. And we focus on young people mainly who have mental health. I'm quite interested, so the lady in the middle, the name's not on the screen, so I'm not sure who it is.
It's Marianne.
Marianne mentioned about how charities like us need to present data to public health in a way that engages them. I wondered if you could maybe expand on that a bit more. Just tell us, give us some tips about kind of stuff you do.
Yeah. I think actually it's an area that I think Imran would say himself. We as a local authority and public health and leisure are very, very keen to strengthen our links with our voluntary sector and charity sector organisations because we know what you can achieve and what you can deliver for our residents, which is very important to us. So I think it's the awareness of the organisations that are out there. That's one thing for us. We know there's multiple organisations out there, some very, very small charities that are doing some very, very big things. So it's bringing that to the fore and not being afraid to actually go and knock on the door of your local authority, public health teams and telling them what you're doing and presenting the information, the evidence of the impact that you're having. I think that's really important. And actually, you know, Imran sat with several charity voluntary sector organisations and heard more about their work and thought about how we can strengthen our links with them as providers. I think another side of that is our One U Health and Wellbeing Service, which is an integrated health and wellbeing service. It's got a consortia under that, so we've got an NHS trust that are leading that, but under the consortia is some very, very small charitable organisations who are delivering our services on our behalf and are commissioned through that. So I think there's a lot around awareness of what you're doing and what's happening on the ground, but also just being aware of things like the JSNA, the health and wellbeing strategies, the STP that Imran talked about earlier, and how you can support us and public health to achieve the priorities and the aims within that.
Thank you. I think you were next, if that's okay.
Okay, my name is Paul Wells. I work at Loughborough University. And the question I wanted to ask was largely trying to link up, I think, what some of you said about language and terminology, in the sense that even terms like leisure, health, sport, you know, are very diverse themselves. Peter, I think it's Fitzhoyton, the guy who does London Sport, he was saying, for example, that the sports sector kind of sat almost in opposition to the leisure sector, simply because leisure was now about lean back, gaming, being in the house, downloading, streaming, set against the more physical activities or, you know, outdoor activities, shall we say, non-house activities that you've largely been talking about as activity. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about really addressing his version of the leisure sector, the one that's kind of like downloading, streaming, playing their games, but are not perhaps engaging with, you know, some of the kind of thoughts and issues that you are, you know, are obviously dealing with all the time.
To me,
Well, feel
the language. God, you took me back because I remember my first assignment when I went and did a sports science degree was, what's the difference between leisure, recreation? That was the first question we were always asked. I mean, I think things have moved on, and the fact that they moved on was actually hearing Mike today. I spent a lot of my career arguing that sport was part of physical activity, and I was sat in the Welsh Government and I had to use the term sport and physical activity, but in actual fact it's a continuum. And it's good to hear that that argument seems to have been won now. So I think we've moved on in terms of the language and that understanding of what that means. I think we've got a lot of learning off each other still to come from this process. So I think, obviously that's going to make a difference. In terms of engaging, and you were talking about different markets and different needs. I mean, understanding the needs of whoever we're trying to engage is at the core of everything that we do. And I think we're getting better at it. It's interesting, so I think having conversations about understanding the evaluation and how we understand those needs. There is a host of information out there that we collect through membership schemes, whatever they are. And often that stuff just sits on a server. Yeah. And it's not brought forward, and it's a wasted opportunity. And trying to understand and use that data more effectively so that we have a better understanding of the behaviours, but also not just looking at our customers. We need to understand, more importantly, probably who our customers are and why they're not our customers. So I think there's a combination there of things that need to come about.
Thanks. Time for a couple more questions. If you'd like to go, sir.
Most councils are basically strapped for cash, so they don't have the financial resources and other resources needed to engage the physically inactive. They don't have the funding to enable coaches to be trained to deal with the elderly that might have medical conditions, etc. So isn't now the time that the councils just rethink their whole strategy as far as funding of projects like to improve the health of the inactive and others, by actually encouraging the development of a social enterprise within the borough that can then go to the community at large, and that social enterprise can then issue shares, so the community can then actually provide the funding to bridge that gap that currently exists that councils can't provide. Just know what your thoughts are on that.
Okay.
It strikes me that I'm not aware of any council that set up a social enterprise with the main objective of improving the health of the inactive.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
I mentioned earlier, that's a really good question. I mentioned earlier about the leisure management contract, and one of the options, we're 3 years away from it, so we've got time now to look at various options. One of those options could well be a social venture or a social enterprise for the very reasons that you've just cited. And one of the functions would include providing a service, but more importantly, the function would also be to bring about significant change and to have a community-led offer, along a sustainable community-led offer. And a social enterprise might be the structure that would help to deliver that.
I mean, we've been working trying to lever opportunities around the dementia-friendly swimming into leisure contracts, because if they're in there, then hopefully that space will be created. So that's one way of doing it. I think we also need to think about sustainability in the long term, because money will be tight. And I suppose there are two models to look at. One is that you can prove that your service is providing a benefit to somebody and a cost saving to someone, so they want to invest in that. So they subsidise your service in effect. And we need to get better at doing that. And there are lots of tools and models out there that can help with that process. And the other is that we create a model in the first place that is cost effective. Now, we know it can take time to bring in numbers through the door, as it were, and so forth. But if we take some of the work that we've been trying to be doing with in terms of dementia-friendly swimming, you could create a model where you use pool time when it's non-peak. So that would help reduce costs in it. And in actual fact, that's probably a really good time, because we know that people with dementia are the best time for them is between 10 and 12 in the day, which is non-peak time. But you could also try and see, can you mix the users within that, and obviously not taking away from supporting the people with dementia. So can you actually make it a cost-effective model? Because you could build the most beautiful model in the world, but if it's not sustainable, we know that it'll go out as soon as the funding disappears. So I think it's trying to understand what the actual cost elements are of it and try and create something that works, but is also more sustainable going forward. So.
And just if I can add, I think you alluded to it, but what's really critical for that sustainability is that you have assets which are capable of generating significant income in order that you can cross-subsidise take-up of services by people that can't afford to pay a market rate for those services. So in Camden at the moment, we're generating a surplus of £2 million a year. And I know that's probably not everyone's experience, and I've considered myself, and Camden consider itself to be extremely fortunate that there's been a political vision over the years that's prioritised investment in that type of provision. But the point I'm making is that with that investment, it's kind of an invest to save and invest to invest strategy, because what we're now able to do is recognise that Camden will have its finances will be under increasing pressure. That's not going to change. I don't see that changing. But through that surplus, we can make a contribution to the corporate saving, but also use the rest to develop and increase physical activity by reinvesting some of that into grassroots physical activity and targeting, developing interventions, possibly through a trust model, possibly through a social enterprise, which should help even further long-term sustainability by being more tax efficient, address some of those populations that are inactive at the moment.
Just conscious I've been given the nod to end, but you had a question, and if you want to ask it quickly, and we'll see if we can respond.
Melody Norris, Director of Community Integration for the Council. I think the health and wellbeing board are more complex when you're in a two-tier authority, because we've got two and a bit boroughs in our health and wellbeing, and very diverse boroughs. But also, I think Sport England are still missing all the sports organisations. The trick with the grassroots organisations is getting more difficult for them to get grants, just to buy equipment, just to keep going. You know, bowls organisations, there's very few grants for those now, and they're performing a real, service for that hard to reach age group, the older age group. And I just think if there's not bits of funding coming for those grassroots organisations, they are going to go under, and we're going to lose a lot of those, public health results that we get from those clubs. Local government is still funding them to a certain extent, but that's changing year on year as our grants start. So something needs to be done. I still think that's being ignored because we're going for the trendier things, the new things, and I think we've got some really good clubs that are providing a good service but can't afford to keep going.
I think I'd say just on that, so from a public health perspective, we had some grants last year, and the way that we managed to provide equipment grants for our sports clubs, and bowling was one of them, was to say that, okay, in return for this grant, which can be spent on equipment, which is very unusual for sports clubs, we want you to show how you're giving something back to the community, and how are you going to engage more of the community. So as part of their application, it would be saying we are going to deliver, beginners program or whatever it might be, and then they got their £10,000 to be able to fix the roof or fix their bowls green or whatever it might have been. But it was just trying to link in the public health opportunity there and how they can support us to achieve our aims, and actually we can support that club to survive and be sustainable. So
We all do that. I don't see grants coming from
no, I agree, That's why we did it, because exactly the same,
Okay, I've just did the second nod there, so I think that's it. I just wanted to take this time to thank the panel for giving up their time today, and hopefully you found that interesting. If you have got any questions that you were wanting to ask but didn't get a chance to, if you drop me a note, I can certainly pass them on. My details will be available from the conference organisers. But thanks again to the panel, much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.